So I'm going to do something today that I don't often do, so I'm going to ask you that you cut me some slack on this, but I'm going to ask that you would turn off your phones, whatever devices you have, just turn them off, power them down, put them in your purse, put them away, whatever you need to do. You say, well, Chris, I read my Bible on my thing, and that's okay. We're going to have the scripture on the screen. And so I really want you to do that, because what I'm going to be talking about is really the essence of really what this sermon series is about. So important, so close to the heart of God, and it's so important for you to hear these things. And so I'm going to ask that you track with me. It's going to be a little bit dense. I'm just going to be honest with you. It's going to be a little tough going. That's why I need you to focus and to concentrate and to keep your attention here. All right, so several years ago there was a book that came out. A book called Lament for a Son. It was written by a guy named Nicholas Walterstorff, who is a professor at Yale University. But he wrote this book in response to the death of his young adult son. When his son Eric was 25 years old, he was climbing on a mountain. He had an accident and he died. Walterstorff writes about this painful event and how hard it is to lose your child. But he says that probably the hardest part of dealing with the death of his son was the finality of it. He said he couldn't even bring himself to look at a picture of his son, because then he was reminded that there aren't going to be any more pictures taken. And how when he was cleaning out some of Eric's things, he looked at Eric's stuff, and in his mind could hear the voice of his son saying, "Hey, Dad, I'm back." But then he would be brought back into reality that he's never going to hear that voice again. Today, I'm not going to explain why bad things happen, because I don't know. I can give biblical answers to why some of these things happen, and they're very real and biblical answers. But let's face it, when we are in the state of mind like this man who wrote the book, we don't want to hear those things. And so, but what I want to do is to tackle this notion that many people have, that I want to believe in a God, but I can't believe in a God who would let all these bad things happen, who would let my young son die. I can't believe in a God who seems to be heartless, because all of these bad things happen. Now, maybe you're here this morning, and maybe now or at one point in the past, or maybe you know somebody who has this attitude. In 1999, George Barna did a nationwide survey of non-churchgoers, and he asked them this simple question: if you could ask God only one question and you knew that he would give an answer, what would you ask? Overwhelmingly, the top response was, why is there pain and suffering in the world? If there is a God, if God is all loving, if God is all powerful, why in the world would he let all of this stuff happen? The only answer to that is that, man, he must be a heartless, cruel God. But I want to suggest to you this morning that there is no such thing as a heartless God according to the Bible. That God does not exist. Just as the killjoy God does not exist, just as the goosebumps God does not exist, the heartless God does not exist. But rather, what I want to understand this morning is that God has tremendous love and compassion for the hurting, and God's heart can be trusted. Now, I know what many of you have sort of dealt with over the years. Many of you have no idea. There are some things that maybe some of you that I know well, yet I still don't know some of the difficult things that have happened to you. And maybe even as you're sitting here this morning, maybe you're struggling because someone close to you died, or maybe you were abused and you've never shared that with anybody. Maybe your parents got divorced when you were a kid. Maybe you've been through a divorce yourself. Maybe as a child you were sexually abused or some inappropriate thing like that, and you've never really dealt with that. Maybe you were physically abused. Maybe you were mentally abused. Or maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, in some random act of whatever happened. And you struggle with the thought of, how in the world can God be a God of love if these things happen? And maybe you've wondered, more importantly, can God heal the hurts that I have? I want to answer some of those questions by showing you a story in the Bible about a woman who was hurting. In fact, she was hurting in a very similar way to Nicholas Walterstorff. We find it in Luke chapter 7. You can look on the screen. Let's read this verse. You can follow along as I read it. But Luke chapter 7. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." And then he went up and he touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. And they were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." And then it says this news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So we find that Jesus is on his way to this town called Nain. And on the way, he kind of comes across this funeral procession. Now, we don't know much about the exact situation. We don't know how the widow's husband died, how long ago he died, how old the son was. Did they have any daughters? We don't know a lot about it. But we do know almost certainly that her son had died within the last 24 hours. Back then, people were buried quickly because of the climate, because of the lack of embalming fluid. And so this mother, just in the last day, her son had died, and the shock and the numbness had started to wear off, and the rawest, deepest moments of pain probably had begun to set in. And then Jesus comes walking by. And I want you to notice a couple of things about the story. First of all, I want us to see and to really understand as we tackle the subject of does God care? Does God have a heart? I want us to see what Jesus felt. What Jesus felt. Look in verse 13. It says, his heart went out to her. His heart went out to her. And as you might know, the New Testament was written in a language called Greek. And the Greek word for this thought of his heart going out to her is this wonderful, awesome Greek word, splankna. Splankna. Turn to your neighbor and say splankna. Just go ahead, yeah. Isn't that a great word? And it's a great word because here's literally what it means, okay? The word literally means to have your guts twisted or ripped out, or to have your bowels exposed. Literally to have your insides turned inside out. It's kind of that feeling that maybe you get when you see some horribly starving child on the TV, or people that have just been dealt with a great blow or loss, and it sort of makes you feel sick inside in the pit of your stomach. That's splankna. And that is the deepest part of ourselves where the compassion flows. And it says that's what Jesus had for her. He had splankna for this woman that had lost her only son. Now, what's interesting here is that this was a very, very common scene. If you or I were walking down the streets back in that day, we'd be like, what's going on? Because it's not normal for us today, but it was incredibly normal back then. So if we were back then, it would be just another everyday occurrence. People die every day, and when they die, this would happen. And so this was just normal for them, whereas it's not really normal for us to see this going through the street. But in spite of the fact that it was kind of like he'd seen this many times before, it says that Jesus just felt this amazing empathy for her. He felt this woman's pain because of what she had gone and was going through. His guts were ripped out. That's what he felt. That's what he felt. What did he do? What did he do? Let's look at the next thing Jesus did. Now, sometimes we have an emotional reaction to somebody's pain, right? But we don't do anything about it. It strikes a chord in us, and because we're human beings, we care, but not enough to actually do something about it. Well, Jesus felt something, but then he does something about it. So what does he do? The verse says that he walks up and he touches the coffin. You say, well, that's kind of normal. Like I've seen people reach out and touch a coffin. But here's what we got to understand. They did not have coffins like we had coffins. Probably this would have been just a flat piece of wood, and the body would have been laid on top of it. And so most likely when it says that Jesus touched the coffin, he wasn't touching the wood underneath, but he was actually reaching out to touch the body. He touched the body. Now there's some amazing things happening here. Jesus here, because of his compassion, because of his love, because of his incredible heart, what he's doing is he's purposely crossing boundary lines that a good Jewish person would not follow. You remember a couple weeks ago we talked about how they had created all of these rules to follow the rules in the Bible, and they compiled these rules into something called the Mishnah, and some 600 extra non-biblical rules that these people had to follow. And one of those rules was that you never that you never touch a dead person. And for these religious leaders, it was all about following the rules. It was all about keeping outward appearances of cleanliness rather than being concerned about actually being pure on the inside. It was all just a show on the outside. And one of the laws was that you could not touch a dead body. Dead bodies were considered unclean. And so if you touched one, you became unclean as well. But Jesus walks up. His heart spills out because of this woman, ignoring religious policies, ignoring what he was going to look like, ignoring what people were going to say. He touches her son, her dead son. He's like, you guys, the religious leaders, you just don't understand. Your boundaries would keep me from showing compassion, but I've got to show this lady compassion. And so I don't care about the boundaries. So Jesus touches the boy. The crowd must have gasped when this happened. But then something even more incredible happens. The boy gasps as well. Jesus' touch brings the boy back to life. And indirectly, it really also brings life back to his mother. You see, back then, a widow was your only hope if you're a widow was your son. And if you had no husband, if you had no son, then likely you would have to do questionable things. And if you had daughters, Lord knows what they would have to do just to be able to get by. And so you were in a horribly vulnerable position if you were a widow and you did not have a son. And so Jesus here not only gives life back to the son, but he gives hope and life back to the woman as well. So these incredible things, how Jesus felt. How Jesus felt. And then what did he do? What did he do? So we're saying God is not a heartless God. And so how does Jesus feel about your hurts? Well, his heart goes out to you. His heart splunknas to you. His guts are ripped out. Now, I understand that it's easy to assume that this isn't the case. That's the reason that you're hurting, maybe because God isn't for you, or maybe that God doesn't care. Maybe you think that God doesn't even notice. Maybe you've had the thought that I doubt God even notices my pain. I mean, there's so many bad things happening, so many people worse off than me. My situation is pretty petty, pretty ordinary. I bet you he doesn't even notice me. But see, that is the cool thing about this story. No one else probably would have even noticed this funeral procession. So common were they. Everybody dies. Lots of funerals happening all over. The situation was totally ordinary. There were widows everywhere. Life just goes on. I don't know how many times I've had people say to me after losing a loved one, they would say, Chris, what was really hard, and maybe you can relate to this, what was really hard for me was when we were going to the cemetery and coming back from the cemetery. And I would look out the window and I would see all these people just going about their day as if nothing had ever happened. And they would talk about how hard that is because something tremendously important and life-shaking and life-altering had happened to them, and yet nobody else seemed to care. I like the way one pastor, he's actually dead, this is kind of ironic, but E.V. Hill, a great pastor, used to say, one day you're going to die. And they're going to go to your funeral and they're going to cry. Then they're going to go to the graveside and then they're going to cry. And then they're going to go back to the church and eat potato salad and get on with their lives, right? I mean, life goes on. But it didn't for Jesus. See, Jesus, he noticed. And Jesus knows your pain. Even when everybody else has gone back to their lives, Jesus still sees your brokenness. And his heart continues to go out for you. See, that's exactly how Jesus feels when we are broken, when we are hurting. That's exactly how he feels because that's how his Father feels. So what does Jesus do about our hurt? Well, he can do exactly what he did for this woman if we'll let him. He can fix it. He can bring healing. He can bring hope. He may not be able to change the circumstances. In her case, death is a part of life, so to speak. And there will be a day when her son would die. There will be a day when she would die. But in spite of the things that happen to us, God can bring hope and healing. See, Jesus isn't somebody who just lived a long time ago. Jesus is somebody who lives today. Who lives today. I don't know if she was going to play it, but I love that Aretha played that song, Because He Lives. And I don't know if you've ever heard the story behind the song. But it was written by Gloria Gaither, and one day she tells a story. She was just having one thing upon another heaped upon her. It was more than she could bear. And she almost couldn't get out of bed, she said. But then one night it came to her that I can get out of bed, I can carry on because Jesus lives. And then she wrote that song. You see, Jesus lives today. He's not some guy that lived years ago. It's great that, yes, maybe that's fine that he had compassion on that woman, but what can he do for me today? He can do the same thing because he lives today. It's something that can happen in your life. But if you use that argument against the existence of God, that bad things happen, actually what that ought to do is that ought to prove to you that the Bible is real, that God does exist. Because unique among all the world religions, Christianity is just very real about life. It's just very real about life. In fact, Jesus was very real about life. In John 16:33, he said, he promised us, in this world, you will have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble. He told the disciples what was going to happen to them. He was always forewarning about what was going to happen. He was realistic, and he wanted us to know. And so if you want an argument against the existence of God or the existence of the Bible, it would be a lot stronger argument if bad things never did happen. Because then the Bible would be wrong. But Jesus said, there's going to be suffering. There's going to be bad times. It's going to happen. And God doesn't want us to hurt. God doesn't want us to suffer, but it is a part of life. Lamentations 3:33. Lamentations is just a book of the Bible that is just all about God. Why does this happen? And why is this happening? And what's going on? But even it says there that God does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anybody. The reason we suffer isn't God. It's because we live in a messed up world that has gone against God's plan. And I might just be really honest with you for a moment. Like I'm always honest with you, but I'm more honest now. Like I've observed over 25 years of ministry that so much of the suffering that comes upon us and that we rail against and we get angry about and we fuss and fume, most of it is brought on by the fact that we haven't been living the way God wants us to live. Not that he's punishing us, but that we reap what we sow. So much of what we deal with in life and what we see around us and is because of the brokenness of the world and the sinfulness, and it starts right here in my heart and your heart. That's exactly the realization that Nicholas Walterstorff came to. He said that the pain he was in over losing a son was exactly the pain that God experienced because he also lost a son who died because of the brokenness of the world and my proclivity to sin and your proclivity to sin. He said that's when it started finally to make sense that God also lost a son. God watched the death of his own son. And he realized that God continues to hurt. God continues to suffer because of us, because of our sin. Then he writes these words, and this is spectacular. He writes, "It is said of God that no one can behold his face and live. I always thought that was because nobody could see God's splendor and live. But he said, a friend said perhaps to me that what that really means is that nobody could see God's sorrow and live. But then he writes this, or perhaps God's sorrow is his splendor. Perhaps God's sorrow is his splendor." Maybe the greatest thing about God is that he would choose to suffer with us, even when he did not have to. And so if you have questions like, well, why do we hurt so much if God loves us? Or if you have doubts about whether Jesus still heals and brings hope, know that there are answers. But at the same time, know that it's okay to have those doubts, that we're all going to think these things at one time or another. But also have the intellectual honesty to pursue those doubts and to understand what the Bible really says about life and about death. And like I said, I totally changed gears on the sermon last night. I was going to go one way with it up until about 11 o'clock last night. I switched gears because I was going to give you the standard, like, here's why things happen and here's God's purposes and all this stuff. And those are all very real, and that's another sermon for another time. But what I started to see was even in spite of the things that happen to us, like we might not be able to explain those, but if we can just get settled, if we can just get settled once and for all, where's God's heart in this thing? Then I think a lot of those questions would fall away. Maybe the greatest thing about God is his sorrow, and that's his splendor. Faith in a God who is for the hurting. Faith in a God who has deep love and caring, not a heartless God, but a God who deeply loves us. And you say, well, why doesn't he heal everything? Why don't our hurts get healed instantly? And I don't know that, but I think it's interesting that in the story we just read a moment ago, that they were healed by Jesus because they were in his path, because they were in his way. They were in the intersection of the direction that he was going. You see, we want all the things that come along with wellness and healing and hope, but we so often make choices that don't put ourselves in the path of where Jesus travels. And so we just assume that God doesn't care. But I wonder if sometimes maybe we're not healed of our hurts right away because we're not putting ourselves in Jesus' path. We're not putting ourselves in a place where he can touch us, where he can speak life and truth into us through other people or through his word. Like, I don't know if that makes any sense. But there were several funeral processions within a few miles of Jesus that day. But it's this boy who was risen. And it was this mom who had her hope restored. Why? Because they were in the path of Jesus. They were in a place where he could go and he could touch the boy. And we need to put ourselves in the path of Jesus. And I don't know what that might look like for you. Maybe it might look like just really opening up your life to prayer, to opening up your life to another person, to confide your hurts and your sins in another person, and allow God to do some deep work in your life that maybe you've never done before. It might be going to a counselor who's a Christian who can help you understand what's going on in your heart and in your mind. I don't know what it is, but I just know that too often we just shut ourselves off. We could come into church. We shut ourselves off from our Christian friends. Like, I can tell you, and I'll just tell you this because, I want to give you just, you can take this away today, but I can tell you that whenever I'm out somewhere, and I know this is hard to believe, but there are people that avoid me. Like, seriously, when I see somebody in Kroger and I can see them avoiding me. Like, I know why they're doing it. Because they know that if I go up and I talk to them, I'm going to start probing. And where you been? And we've missed you. And why aren't you in church? And then they're going to talk about whatever's going on in their life, and they just don't want to do that. We want to keep it pushed down and stored away and locked away. We don't want to put ourselves in a place where Jesus can heal us. So what do we do? What do we do when we continue to hurt? I'm going to give you a couple things real quickly. First of all, please understand that because of God's heart, because his heart is just ripped out for us in compassion, please give God the benefit of the doubt. Seriously, I hate when people do just assume the worst about me. And let's not do that about God. There is a God in heaven who loves us. And even in the worst of times, he has decided in his heart, he has purposed in his heart to love us. You can imagine maybe you're meeting a friend for lunch somewhere, and this has obviously never happened to me and Lori because she's always on time wherever she goes. But let's just imagine that you're waiting for somebody and they're late and all of a sudden you're getting angry and you're starting to fume, and then you say, calm down. Maybe they were in an accident, or maybe something happened, or maybe this or maybe that. And then all of a sudden you start to get concerned about them. You're giving them the benefit of the doubt. Right? You're not just assuming the worst. And so then when they get there, finally, then they can tell you, I just lost track of time. Then you can kill them. But before that moment, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And let's give God the benefit of the doubt because of what he has done for us. He gave his son his sorrow for us when he did not have to. But more importantly, when you're hurting, when these questions and these doubts are going through your mind, here's the thing that we need to understand. That while we're in this world, while we're exiles in this world, foreigners in a strange land, that we are in the middle. We're in the middle of our story. And I don't care what age you might be or what might be going on in your life. If you are taking a breath upon this earth, you are in the middle of your story. And if you're a Christian, the story has a much better ending than the middle that you're in right now. You're in the middle of the story. Revelation puts it this way. In Revelation 21, And Nicholas Walter Storff in his book quotes this, and he says, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God will be with them and will be their God, and he'll wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Behold, I am making everything new. And what that passage says is that we are in the middle here, but there's coming a day when things will be new. Things will be restored. Things will be reclaimed. And Jesus Christ will do that. We are in the middle of this story. Do not judge God based on the middle of the book. I read a book not too long ago, and I'm not going to tell you what it was. It was a horrible book by John Grisham. Anyway, it's like number one on the bestseller list, his newest, best, greatest thing. It's been a long time since I've read a John Grisham book, but I read the first few pages at the bookstore, and I got kind of hooked. I was excited. Finally, another great Grisham book, and so I bought the book. Like, I don't ever do this, but I paid $25 for it because I was so into it. The book was an absolute snooze fest. I mean, it was horrible. So what I did was I got to the middle of the book. And if you've ever read a John Grisham book, you know that there's always like something at the end, something coming around the bend, some twist, some turn. I thought, I can't wait till I get to it. I turned to the last page, read the last page, and it was a boring book. It was like so boring. I should have judged that book by the middle, but I didn't. But we don't make the opposite mistake where we judge God by the middle here, without understanding that there is an incredible ending. There is an incredible twist. There are things that we can never imagine that God has waiting for us. We are in the middle of the story. There's a movie, maybe you've heard of it, a movie portraying the life of Christ, and it's simply called very creatively the Jesus film. Now, the Jesus film was produced many years ago by Campus Crusade for Christ, and it's been translated into all kinds of languages, and millions of copies have been distributed through the world. This was originally the brainchild of a guy named Paul Eshelman. He was kind of responsible for it. And what they would do is they would take this movie and they would take projectors and sometimes generators, and they would go into these remote places where they don't have electricity, and they would show this movie. And it's changed hundreds of thousands of lives by watching this. But Paul Eshelman, the guy responsible for it, tells of the time many years ago when they went into this place in Mozambique on the southeast coast of Africa. And he said most of the people watching had never heard the gospel. They'd never heard about Jesus. But as they were watching this film, they fell in love. They fell in love with him. It was a refugee camp, actually, and they fell in love with Jesus through watching the film. And it came to the part where Jesus was arrested and beaten and then led away to be crucified. And they began to weep and to wail and to gnash teeth. And they charged the screen. And they just would not stop wailing and weeping. In fact, their cries stirred up the dust from the ground. It was impossible to finish the film, so the projector was turned off. And he said for more than an hour, these people just wept and wailed at what had happened to this man. Their splunkna had been spilled out. Well, finally, the film crew members and the spiritual counselors tried to approach the villagers to talk to them and to pray with them and to explain to them that the story wasn't over. The story wasn't over. That was just the middle of the story. Yes, they're suffering. But that's only the middle, and there's a better thing yet to come. So finally, after more than an hour, he said, the Jesus film crew turned the movie back on so the people could know the end of the story. Because Jesus' story does not end in a death on a cross, but in resurrection and new life and eternal hope. And so Jesus rises triumphantly from the grave on the third day. Not only does he experience new life, but he offers new and eternal life to anyone who will accept it. And he said when the townspeople saw how the story ended, the crowd exploded as if a dam had burst open. Everybody cheering and dancing and hugging one another and jumping up and down. And later, nearly everyone in the crowd made the decision that they wanted to accept Jesus Christ into their lives as the one who took their sins. And so he could take their sins away, as the one who suffered for them, as the one who would eventually take away their suffering. Earlier, I read you half of what Jesus said in John 16:33. He said, in this world, you will have trouble. But that's not all he said. He said, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Folks, in this life, we are in the middle of the story. And there's suffering in our story. But there's also a God whose heart is incredibly compassionate for you, for us when we hurt, for us when we grieve. And he wants to come right alongside us and to lead us through it. There are no simple answers to why an all-powerful God can do anything and yet doesn't stop bad things from happening. There's no answers that will satisfy critics and will satisfy people. But I have another question that I often like to ask when people say this to me. And my question is simply, well, you know, you can believe that there's no God, or you can believe that if there's God, he's a cruel God and you don't want anything to do with him. But my question to you would be, well, like what better answer do you have as to why all this stuff happens? Like, at least the Bible explains it. We may not like the explanation, but what is your better alternative understanding of this? And how does that help you in your life? Well, there's no God. It's just meaningless, and we live and then we die, and there's nothing after. How, does that help you in your life? How is that better than a God who we may not always understand? But listen, a God who has demonstrated time and time again that he loves us, that his heart is moved by the suffering that we go through. Oftentimes, they don't have an answer to that. Like, what's a better alternative? Jesus Christ died so that we can have hope and healing, and that is God's heart.